Lauren, DSA, Brendan, DSA. They're awesome people, so thank you.
So another way to support Amanda's campaign is to buy some of the screen printed t-shirts that were just screen printed recently, as in like last night. Especially if you live locally, grab a shirt, they're beautiful, and wear them around and talk to people about Amanda. So my name is Lauren, and I'm a member of the Tompkins County Progressives, and I would like to introduce Brendan McQuaid. And I know Brendan McQuaid because he is a member of our Ithaca DSA chapter, and he also runs a reading group, a Jacobin reading group that is fabulous, and he's really important to us for running that. Thanks, Brendan. And also that he is here to talk about what he does in his day job. He's an assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Cortland. And I want to also mention that he has a book being published by the University of California Press in August 2019, and it's called Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence Fusion and Mass Supervision. So yeah, please come and speak to us today. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction and this opportunity to speak. So as Lauren mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Cortland. I teach mostly in the criminology major, although I'm decidedly not a criminologist. My academic research really began, in a sense, when I was in high school. I was 17 when 9/11 happened. My congressman, I grew up in southeastern Connecticut. My congressman at the time was a Republican named Rob Simmons. He was a former CIA veteran in the Vietnam War. He ran a provincial interrogation center in a place called Phu Yen Province, commanded a what we would call a death squad, publicly admitted to denying medicine to injured detainees. In the Bush administration, he was a ardent proponent of the war on terror, and one of the congressional architects of Homeland Security. So specifically, he was involved in the creation of what's called the National Network of Fusion Centers, these 79 interagency intelligence centers that sit under Homeland Security. So, when I was, a teenager working at a small grocery store, his wife often would come in to go shopping, and it always kind of struck me that I was one degree of separation removed from someone who I thought should be, tried for war crimes. So this, really was the beginning of my politics, right? I eventually went to, or my political involvement. I eventually went to Binghamton University to pursue a PhD. I studied these interagency intelligence centers that my former congressman was involved in setting up, and that's what the book that Lauren so nicely plugged is about. But I'm not here to talk about that today. I'm here to talk about my movement work per se, and really about debates on the abolition of policing, right? So I see this as as an essential question for socialist movements. Historically, socialism has had a problem with state violence, right? The communist countries were police states. The social democratic countries were, nicer versions of capitalist states. Neither of them had a good answer for the problem of the security apparatus, right? For the problem of state violence. So today in the United States, this debate has come back, right? And it's been brought back in many ways by Black Lives Matter, right? But the thing that's often lost, right, is even though we associate, the abuses of the criminal justice system with, with as a minority issue, it's really a universal issue, right? And I'm not just saying that in some squishy liberal way that, an injustice for one is an injustice for all. I mean that in a direct material sense, right? To the best we know, and we don't know very well because most police agencies are not required to report the number of people that they kill. But to the best we know, between 900 and 1,100 people are killed by American police every year, right? So that's more than many conflicts that are, acknowledged by the international community as war zones, right? Depending on the data set you look at, between 40 and 50% of those victims of police-involved shootings are white, right? So even though we think of Black Lives Matter and we might think of this as a black issue, it's really a universal American issue, right? But this basic fact has not really made it to the, to our nascent socialist movement, right? So, out of Black Lives Matter came a policy agenda called the Vision for Black Lives. One of the proposals that came out of the Vision for Black Lives was a divest, reinvest approach to abolition, right? We're going to divest resources from the security apparatus and reinvest them in better things, right? DSA endorsed this, right? DSA endorsed the divest, reinvest approach to abolition, right? But since that endorsement happened, there's been little movement, right? There's also been a pushback against abolitionist politics, right? So just as a little background, right? One of the more, the kind of beginning of this pushback happened in the pages of Jacobin, where this guy, Robert Lancaster, dismissed abolition as promising a heaven on earth that will never come to pass. In response, Dan Berger, Miriam Kaba, and David Stein argued that Lancaster's presentation of abolitionism was a straw man, and abolition is not a kind of idealistic utopian project, but it is a very pragmatic one that fights for what they call non-reformist reforms, those measures to reduce the power of an oppressive system while illuminating that system's inability to solve the crisis it creates. Right? So we can think of this divest, reinvest approach to abolition as one of these non-reformist reforms. Right? But the question is, what does this actually look like? What does this actually mean? Right? As it stands, the divest, reinvest strategy to abolition is dangerously vague and could be easily co-opted. Divest into what is the question we need to answer, right? So to try to answer that question, I'm going to do two things, right? I'm going to talk about what we're divesting from, right? I'm going to talk about what the police actually do. Then I'm going to take a deep dive into the history of the police idea, and then I'll wrap up with what I think the implications of that are for socialist strategy. So first, what the police actually do, right? Policing is not about crime control, right? This idea that policing is about law and order is a myth, right? Criminal law enforcement is something that most police officers do with a frequency located somewhere between virtually never and very rarely. Right? The majority of calls for police assistance are for service rather than crime. In an average year, only 15 to 20% of all the calls to the police are about crime. What is initially reported by the public as crime is often found to not be crime by the responding officer. Studies have shown that less than a third of the time spent on duty that officers spend on duty is on crime-related work, that approximately 8 out of 10 incidents handled by patrols are regarded by the police themselves as non-criminal matters, that the percentage of police effort devoted to traditional criminal law matters does not exceed 10% and is probably as little as 6% of a patrol officer's time. Right? Moreover, most of the time, police do not use criminal law to restore order. In the U.S., police officers make an average of 1 arrest every 2 weeks. One study found that among 156 officers assigned to high crime area of New York City, 40% did not make a single felony arrest in a year. In Canada, the average police officer records 1 indictable crime occurrence every week, makes 1 indictable crime arrest every 3 months, and secures 1 indictable crime conviction every 9 months. So if police are not responding to crime, what do they actually do? Right? So my contention is what police do is they fabricate social order. Right? So what does that mean? To explain that, I'm going to take a deep dive into the history of the police idea. Right? For most people begin the history of policing with the first uniformed police departments in the first half of the 19th century. Policing, however, did not begin with the London Metropolitan Police or the NYPD. The origins of police can be traced back to the collapse of feudalism, when it consisted of ad hoc, reactive measures to maintain the structure of manners threatened by the decay of the existing estates and the crises provoked by the Black Death, peasant revolts, and the Protestant Reformation. By the 17th century, policing came to mean a more active and conscious intervention grounded on the principle of good order. Right? The idea of policing was mixed up in larger conversations about how to promote, how to administer poverty and promote commerce and wealth. History remembers these conversations as cameralism and police science in the German-speaking areas and mercantilism elsewhere in Europe. So during this early period, from the 16th century to the mid-19th century, policing was concerned with the minutiae of social life, right? The means of comfort, public health, the maintenance of roads, bridges, town buildings, public security, the regulation of the provision of goods and services, the performance of trades and occupations, religion, morals, manners, the behavior of servants towards their masters, right? So in this way, police power nurtured the kind of emergent capitalist economy via the intensified and broad administrative regulation of the poor. Right? So Mark Neoclaus, the philosopher whose work I draw heavily upon, explains this. He says the primary aim of policing was to fashion a labor force by making the able-bodied beggar and vagrant offer their labor power for sale on the market. This was the process by which the feudal workforce was forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. Short of that, they should be made to work in hospitals or on public works projects. The 18th century workhouse, like its 19th century successor, performed a joint task. It instilled labor discipline into the poverty-stricken yet idle or unemployed poor, and it encouraged industrious workers to believe that the only option to the discipline of so-called free labor was the discipline of the workhouse. The hospitals, workhouses, and other places of confinement were part of a project of constructing a modern workforce that traded its labor power for a wage. Right? So as such, we should think of policing as the center of the construction of a new form of order, a capitalist order. Right? More broadly, this means that the original idea of policing was synonymous with a broader set of state interventions that we would now call social policy. So what German princes and their advisors called the policy stat should not be thought in terms of its direct translation, the police state, but rather in the substantive meaning of early policing. It was a policy state, the centralizing administrative state of the absolutist period, the precursor to the more modern welfare state. By the mid-19th century, liberalism supplanted older theories of social order and development, and the market and the individual replace the state and sovereign as the theoretical center of political life. Right? In this context, the meaning of policing contracted to the present emphasis on law and order, and the expanded notion of policing was lost to history. These philosophical shifts, the rise of liberalism, masks the capital's reliance on the state to fabricate social relations, but it didn't end the structural necessity of such work. So in this context, the descendants of the old police science, what we now call public health, urban planning, criminology, varied administrative discourses, seek to regulate different domains of social life in a manner consonant with the class biases of the original police idea. Right? So in this sense, the different genres of social policy are also in all ways police discourses. Right? Social policy is a softer form of social police. Right? In other words, when I say the police fabricate social order, I mean that policing connotes the varied administrative mechanisms that manage the conflict and contradiction that defines capitalism. So capitalism is an order predicated on the infinite and endless accumulation of private wealth. As a result, capitalism is a order of insecurity, right? What Marx and Engels famously described as the constant revolutionizing of production, the uninterrupted disturbance of social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. Their famous quote: all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new ones are antiquated before they can form. All that is solid melts to air. Right? So if capitalism is an order of insecurity, it demands a politics of security. Right? This is why in a rarely read text from 1844, Marx called police the supreme concept of bourgeois society. Right? So many Marxists have made this critique of social policy, but they have not made the connection to the deeper history of policing. Right? So hence, Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis in Schooling Capitalist America detail what they call the correspondence principle, where the nature of social interaction and individual rewards in public schools mirrors those of the workplace. Francis Fox Piven and Richard Coward in Regulating the Poor conclude that social welfare policy regulates the labor market. It contracts during times of economic expansion to cheapen the cost of labor. It expands during economic crisis to dampen working class militancy. Howard Watskin in The Second Sickness analyzes healthcare from the same perspective. He shows us that access to healthcare expands and contracts with the ebb and flow of popular unrest. It creates capitalist markets through public subsidies. It depoliticizes the politics of health with an individual approach. In a more recent work, Bruce Cohen analyzes the work of PSY professionals to normalize the fundamental inequalities of capitalist societies as a natural and common sense. Right? So in other words, your teacher is a cop, your social worker is a cop, your doctor is a cop, your therapist is a cop. All right, so what does this long detour into the deep history of the police idea mean for socialism and abolition? Right? I think this expanded concept of police power, right, that we can get from the history of policing, expands the horizon of abolitionist politics and clearly situates it within a revolutionary transition to socialism. Right, so we can now answer the question posed by the divest, reinvest approach to abolition. Right? Reinvest into what? Social services as they currently exist. That would mean shrinking the uniformed police and expanding the soft social police. Right? Well, such efforts would make a meaningful difference in the lives of those most victimized by the police. It would hardly challenge the rule of capital in the modern state. Instead, abolishing police power requires rethinking social services on terms that explicitly challenge the most basic social relations that police power maintains, right? Private property, the commodity form, the wage relation. In other words, a positive project of abolition would require a reinvestment in care in the commons, right? So to try to make this more practical, DSA's kind of number one demand, Medicare for all. This could be and should be advanced as an abolitionist demand, right? By decommodifying healthcare and transforming it into a universal public good, it could be part of a reinvigorated social democratic commons. So in the short and medium terms, a socialist movement could organize political power to redirect resources from police, prisons, and the security apparatus and reinvest it in a series of socialist programs, a common decency that should be afforded to everyone by virtue of their inalienable humanity, right? A universal cradle-to-grave care, universal health care, free education, etc., and a basic right to life, housing, and a job or a basic income guarantee. In the longer term, the horizons of what we could call abolition socialism could also help confront questions that have historically plagued socialist movements. So the reconstitution of the commons would also require reckoning with the history of colonial violence and dispossession. Right? Capital emerged through a disproportionate destruction of particular cultures. Right? It created a hierarchy of nations and peoples. The modern capitalist world system, the world economy that we live in, was created through various projects of policing and pacification. It was also and always what people call racial capitalism. So in other words, meaningfully abolishing police power and recreating the commons would also require addressing historic injustices that divided the working class into mutually antagonistic nations and races. So in this way, reparations for slavery, for colonial dispossession, for unequal North and South relations can be thought as a necessary part of both the transition to socialism and the abolition of police power. So the contemporary debate on socialist strategy is more complex and rich than I have time to present in this brief talk. However, by way of conclusion, I would like to name what I think is an exceptionally misguided position. There are some, those associated with the momentum tendency in DSA and the new online publication, The Socialist Call, that seek to narrow the focus of socialist struggle to battles in the workplace. Right? If we accept this line, the struggle against police violence and mass incarceration remains incorrectly understood as a minority issue. It becomes a secondary concern, something that will be mitigated in some indirect fashion by building the structural power of labor, by organizing the working class into unions, and winning social democratic measures like universal health care. So in response, the ideas that I'm trying to offer here propose a broader conception of class and class struggle that I contend is both more in line with historical realities and more capable of winning a world worthy of the name socialism. So thank you.
Quick question. In the context of your presentation and your earlier percentages of how much police work is actually dealing with crime, how do you integrate the real-life investment in military hardware and the distribution and militarization of police in America, including Ithaca?
Right. So my opinion is that the idea of police militarization is a misguided one, and it's not that it's not misguided because police using military gear isn't an issue. It's misguided because the police and military have developed in tandem. They've always developed in tandem. So just as a brief example, the father of police professionalization is this guy, August Vollmer. He was a Marine veteran of the U.S.-Filipino War, the Philippine insurrection. He came back to the United States in the early 20th century and said, we need to clean up these corrupt police departments. We need to clean up, break the power of the urban machines and professionalize police. And the way he did that was by bringing military discipline to police forces, by reorganizing police on military models. right? So the original act of police reform, what we now consider as police professionalization, which is often put against militarization as some kind of alternative, was actually was militarizing the police. So when I talk about abolition, I'm not just talking about police, I'm not just talking about prisons, I'm talking about the state's capacity for violence, right? So, the divest, reinvest approach to abolition could take a anti-imperialist hue, right? It could involve, and it should involve the the divestment from the entire security apparatus, right? Which would include the military, the 16 federal agencies that form the intelligence community.
So you'd include the Pentagon.
Yeah. Yeah, I do not see a meaningful distinction between policing and warfare. I think that's a liberal distinction that hamstrings our politics. We fight on their terms and we lose, right? What abolition really is about state violence, right? It's about trying to transform the structure of the state and limit the capacity for harm, right? And that would include everything from the CIA to the DOD to the state police to the smallest podunk police department in some rural town.
Thank you.
So that's some food for thought, as well as food for our stomachs, which is downstairs. So let's go down, get something to eat, have a little chat, visit the restrooms, which are at the end of the hall, to the left for the men's and to the right for the women's, and come back here around 1 o'clock, and we'll start with just some Q&A and political thinking.
And we had 18 donations, so if we get 2 more donations to Amanda, we got 20 donations, which would be awesome. So if anybody had forgotten and needed a reminder to reach out for their phone, please do so.